My name's Chubs, the Addict. I'm a grateful, recovering member of Narcotics. Well, I'm a clean member of Narcotics Anonymous. Sometimes I'm even recovering. Um, yeah, I'm here just to talk about my personal experience with the alternate service informational structure, kind of better known as ASIS. Um, I don't speak for ASIS. I don't speak for NA. Nobody does. And that was one of the things I learned coming into Narcotics Anonymous was they used to read it at every meeting I went to, and at some point that stopped. They'd say, or almost every meeting, they'd say nobody speaks for NA right at the beginning. So everything I say is my personal experience. Yeah, the group I belong to never joined as is. I joined a home group that then decided to join with other home groups in continuing to create and hold directly accountable to them a service known as the alternate service informational structure. Um, yeah, I give a little bit of history on it, I guess. I've got some notes just so I don't forget things. Um, yeah, I'll try and be really brief. It as is has come into being, I guess, twice in a sense, as far as the meetings. Back in 1990, I think it was about 7 groups in Pennsylvania left the Little Apple area, completely withdrew from the service structure at the time. What we maybe tend to today uh, call the NAS service structure, even though NAS, they had not stolen our name back then. Um, and I believe the concepts hadn't even been foisted on the fellowship at that point. But they left that service structure, and I don't have all the details why, and I won't get into the ones that I know. I wasn't there. I was never a member of any of those groups. And they started meeting, working on literature projects. They still believed in open participation and groups being able to write. And at some point, the idea came up to start having this little traditionalist gathering and maybe create an alternate service structure. And I guess they were meeting at the something called the Cedar Church, for those of you who were familiar back then, in 1990. And then in Lehigh, Pennsylvania, they got together and had the first traditionalist gathering. By 1993, they actually had groups that wanted to participate in this, what's known as is. And I'm not clear on all the exact details, but this was not just at this point Pennsylvania. There were addicts or groups from Oakland, California coming out to meet at that time. Eventually, what is a lot of times people refer to as these 4 groups, and it was really actually a collection of groups and addicts from 4 different areas of the country, because I believe at this time they actually formed in Pennsylvania what's called the Group Conscience Area back in 1990, which still exists today, if I'm not mistaken. But they got together and they started holding these annual service conferences that stand completely outside of the conceptual structure. The structure today that we know is the one that's based on the concepts. And that ran through about 1998. And I'm being really brief here. In 2005, I think they started talking about getting this thing back together. They never closed the P.O. box. The groups of the Group Conscience area kept that as is P.O. box going. And in 2006, 10 groups got together and restarted this conference. In 2007, there were only 5 groups that showed up. Not today in 2020. Usually there will be representation for in excess of 20 groups at the conference. I don't know how that's going to look this year with the whole virus thing going on. And I know there are over 100 registered groups that show up on the well over 100. It might be 150, but it show up on the schedule that they put out as far as groups that have chosen to make that service structure accountable to them. And semantics, if I say join as is, nobody really joins a service structure. We follow our traditions. And this is all just my opinion, but we hold those service structures directly accountable to our groups. We direct them, we create them, we continually create them, even if we weren't around when they were first created. And so that's just a brief history for those that matters to. I think a lot of times whenever we're talking about our history, we tend to talk about Jimmy K or Grateful Dave or this person did, and we tend to put an addict on a pedestal, and most of the time it's actually been addicts who were doing what their home group asked them to do and participating in group conscience. Uh, for instance, with the whole Baby Blue thing, Grateful Dave had a lot to do with that, but he always stated in the court case and hey, I'm acting on the direction of my home group and we're participating in a group conscience. So I kind of wanted to present the history, how it actually happens through the groups creating something. I'll go over a few terms that a lot of people are not familiar. You probably, if you're familiar with it at all, have heard of ASIS, the Alternate Service Informational Structure, the FSC, which is the Fellowship Service Conference, and then something known as the Anonymity Foundation. So I want to kind of briefly I talk about what those terms mean for anybody who's confused. The Alternate Service Informational Structure is this service structure, or maybe even lack of structure, that the groups have created as an alternate to this current NOS system. For a while, people would talk about the traditionalist gathering and which is just traditionalists getting together every year for fellowshipping, and what would also take place is this as-is conference. Several years ago, a group brought a motion to actually give the conference a name, which would be the Fellowship Service Conference, and that motion did pass. I believe it was the next year. So the Fellowship Service Conference is just where the groups come together to give as-is direction. The Anonymity Foundation is it's not even a corporation at this point because the groups haven't asked it to be. But if there were any legal issues or anything to do with copyrights or anything like that, there is an elected agent of the Anonymity Foundation, and that would be the foundation that handles those type of things. But that has been very minimal at this point, and really because the groups need to define things and need to ask for things, that will continue to just be what it is until the groups say, hey, this is what we want to do with this. The groups that do participate in the ASIS structure do write literature. And occasionally they will bring a piece of literature to the conference for approval of the fellowship that participates in that conference. At this point, I want to state something. The conference does not give permission for groups to write anything. The groups don't need to have something conference approved to use it. We have what's called home group approved literature. And if we write a piece of literature, the home group that I belong to, if we write a piece of literature and present it as home group approved literature, we're not speaking for other groups. We're not speaking for NA as a whole. This is NA literature as approved by our home group. The idea of approving literature at a conference is more a show of support, more a show of unity in the face of some of these threats from, and not even threats, but attacks from outside services, the NOS structure in particular, that these groups can say, no, we are a member of a service, or we do participate in a service body that has created literature that has approved this. This is NA approved literature by the groups that have approved it to participate in this conference. And it's not even really, it's more about, to me, and this is all my perspective, it's more about the way we support each other spiritually. So, and I don't know how clear I'm being, and hopefully I won't be as wordy as I usually am, and we'll get to time for questions if people have them. The Fellowship Service Conference, the ASIS structure, the entire thing is based entirely on the traditions. There are no concepts. There are no Robert's Rules of Order. There are some motions that have passed. Originally, the ways that things were just done because the groups that were small at that time that came together opted to do them that way. And more recently, we've had motions actually made and passed that do define ways the conference will run, but these are always based in the traditions and how we protect group conscience. I'm going to refer back to my notes so I can kind of try and be clear on this. So when the conference was formed, and again, I wasn't there, but from my understanding, what the groups wanted to do was design a service structure that does what it's supposed to do, and that's respond to what the groups ask them to do, and provide information without having some corporate body tinge that information and put their own spin on it, where they're actually providing information to those groups. And they specifically, they referenced traditions 2, 4, 7, and 9. And again, my perspective, a lot of it interacting with people who were there, a lot of it from gaining my own understanding at the conference. But these are my words that are coming out of the way I've observed things, being somebody who's been able to go to that conference since 2015. There were so tradition 2 is based on the second tradition, and the idea that the traditions mean exactly what they say. So group conscience happens in an NA home group. It happens nowhere else. It's not delegated to a service structure. It doesn't happen at the area level. We don't renegotiate or reinterpret what the groups have told us. So the idea is that the groups run things, the groups do things, and that's where group conscience happens. We don't have this separate group of addicts who are more experienced on a service body that get to redecide what the groups have already decided. For purpose of the services is to distribute the information from the other groups so that they can come together and decide on things where they have decided where the groups need to consult with one another, which brings us to tradition 4 and the idea that the autonomy of the group is absolute. And I know a lot of people like to say, well, what about accepted matters affecting other groups or NA as a whole? Interestingly, in our traditions, there are no policing powers granted to anybody to kick a group out of NA. There's definitely no policing powers for services to tell groups what to do. In the 9th tradition, there's the only policing powers there are the powers of the groups to tell the services what to do. The autonomy of the groups is absolute. And I know this as well from going into the history myself and reading what our predecessors, who we reference in our traditions, wrote about what tradition 4 meant and why it was written the way it was written. And the part about accepted matters affecting other groups or NA as a whole is just that. When the group that I belong to wants to do something that involves other groups or might affect them, we have the responsibility as a group to consult with them before we move forward. If the group that I belong to writes a piece of literature and the group across town doesn't want to use that piece of literature and doesn't adopt it, it's the responsibility of my group to A, consult with them, and B, say, hey, this is our home group's literature. There's no majority rule in Narcotics Anonymous. There's no mechanism for government anywhere in our traditions. In fact, it's quite the obvious. One of the things that the predecessors who wrote our traditions said was that the traditions create basically a benign anarchy. So if there's any question as to the absolute autonomy of each home group, that should clear it up. But again, your understanding of the traditions is yours, mine is mine. That's the way I've come to understand the traditions, through my own research and through wanting to understand and apply them rather than interpret them. Tradition 7, the idea that groups are self-supporting. Only the groups are self-supporting. We don't have the idea, and again, I'm speaking from my perspective, but the idea in as is not that as is self-supporting. The groups are self-supporting because the groups are autonomous. Service structures are not autonomous. They are directly accountable to the groups. If a service structure is self-supporting and self-funding, then it becomes autonomous and doesn't need the group, and we can see that and I don't want to talk too much about NAS because a lot of, I know the group that I belong to, and in talking with others, a lot of people who have decided to participate in this as a structure are pretty much of the opinion that NAS is irrelevant, and that what we need to do is focus on building services that we may create. And again, before I jump into tradition 9, because I'm talking about what we may create as groups, these service boards and committees, back to tradition 7, a lot of us don't believe that we even donate to or fund service bodies. We fund services on a line item basis. So when the groups ask the service body to do something, If we don't already know what it's going to cost, those who we've asked to find out what it's going to cost will tell the groups what it's going to cost. And then if the groups want that, they fund that service directly. They don't give a blank check to a service body. Something that is unique to, well, I can't speak for every service body in existence. Something that I have seen from my perspective that so far has been unique to ASIS is there is no fund flow in the service body. There's no treasurer. Right now, the groups handle everything. And I would go back to our fifth tradition, that it's the groups who are responsible for carrying the NA message. It's not about paying employees or delegating to a service body carrying our message for us. It's the groups who do that. There's no treasurer at ASIS. There's a group of home groups who put the conference on every year, and that doesn't mean it has to stay in the same place. We've talked before at the conference about moving in other places if groups want to step up and say, hey, we're going to host a conference this year. That's something that could definitely happen. It's just something that hasn't happened to this point. Yeah, it's really weird. The groups that put on, it's not weird, it's spiritual, it's different. So the groups that put on the conference, they will take care of the funding, and they will collect the money. They will, when people come and they register, and if somebody can't afford the registration is actually about paying for the facility and the food. And it's been really weird because every year that I've been there, they have come very close to what that facility actually cost. And when there's been an overage, it's usually been less than the deposit required for the next year, and it's applied to that. There has been talk recently of possibly the conference handling some literature. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously because maybe people are unfamiliar. A lot of the groups who participate in ASIS or make that directly accountable to them, they print their own literature. They write their own literature. They use a lot of the old school literature. They print a lot of baby blues, grade books, some second editions, things of that nature. I'm sorry, my throat's getting dry. I'm gonna need to take a drink here, so I apologize. But these groups do a lot with literature, and so far that's all been handled with co-ops. Usually it will be a group who's basically groups pulling their resources to order printing through one group or another, or a collection of groups to keep all of our costs lower. There have been talk recently. There was actually a motion made where to have the conference handle some literature development, or not development, excuse me, some literature distribution. Some groups were against that because they're just very scared of going back to groups had services handling money at all, and then others were, and a lot of those were surprisingly open-minded to what maybe this could work. But others, the idea was, hey, the amount of literature that's being asked to be held on hand through this motion is just too small. We'd go through it in a week. So because nobody speaks for that conference, no person and no home group, I don't know where that's going to go. That could be something that at some point the conference will, or the service structure at some point might handle money with regard to literature. For now, the groups continue to distribute their own and co-op in a way. And I'm kind of jumping ahead to some other things. So let me just kind of jump to Tradition 9, which I said they based the conference, from what I understand, originally on the groups that started this thing back in the 90s on Traditions 2, 4, 7, and 9. And obviously 9 is that we make, Narcotics Anonymous as such ought never be organized, but we may create service bodies directly, service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. And it's exactly that. We may create these things. So none of, again, I can't speak for these other groups. A lot of us don't feel there is any obligation for us to participate in or even acknowledge a service structure that is outside of the traditions or does things differently than we as home groups think they ought to be done. Does that mean that we view ourselves as separate from the rest of Narcotics Anonymous? Absolutely not. A home group that has always used the non-structure, a home group, most of these, let's be honest, they know nothing else. Sometimes we exist in an echo chamber and we don't realize the percentage of the fellowship that really, no matter what part of the traditionalist movement you're involved in or whatever you're involved in, even if you're involved in something that you don't consider part of the traditionalist movement, a lot of people don't even know this stuff is here. We're still the fellowship, and I've heard people say this today already. I haven't been here the whole time, but the fellowship and the services we may create have nothing to do with each other in the sense of who's part of NA. So groups all over the world, we're every bit as much a part of Narcotics Anonymous, and as a group that only uses the non-structure, uses a different alternate structure, for lack of a better term, than we do. They're as much a part of RNA as we are of theirs. We happen to create and make directly accountable to us different services. With that said, a lot of these traditions, when we talk about service bodies, they are through the lens of Tradition 9. Tradition 9 creates the ability for us to accept or reject any services that any group may or may not create. We can pull out of them, we can dissolve them, but again, those services are directly accountable to us. So when we talk about the seventh tradition, the service body is not self-supporting. When we talk about the fifth tradition, the primary purpose of a service body is not to carry the NA message to the still suffering addict. That's the primary purpose of the groups. The primary purpose of a service body, in my view, and in the view of a lot of groups and people who I talk to, again, this is my perspective, but the primary purpose of a service body is to do what the groups direct them to do. And the groups have just that one purpose, to carry the message to the still suffering addict. That way, the groups drive services. The services do not become autonomous themselves. They do not become self-supporting. They don't have their own maybe list of 9 long-term goals that involve a diverse mix of revenue streams, because we don't need the groups to fund us, and we can tell them what to do in addition to not listening to what the groups are telling us to do. So obviously all of the traditions apply when we're talking about that service body, but they specifically address these traditions 2, 4, 7, and 9. And again, a lot of what I've said here, the way I understand them, I think that's in line with the original founding, but I wasn't there. You can talk to on any issue in Narcotics Anonymous, where the services that stand outside of the fellowship and serve it as a strict tool for Narcotics Anonymous. Sometimes you can talk to 1,000 addicts and you'll get 1,000 different perspectives. So when I say something, take what you can use and leave the rest. But I'm doing my best to fairly represent the way these things operate and what they are. With regard to the traditions, a lot of the groups that participate in this structure use the Gray Book. I'm just going to read a real brief excerpt from the Gray Book, because to me it really encapsulates a lot of what the ASIS structure is about. It's very prophetic about things that had not happened when these words were written, and that have happened since. But at the same time, it really solves a lot of the issues. It's actually in Tradition 7 in the Gray Book, which the traditions will be Chapter 6. And it just says, I'm going to real brief excerpt. It says, NA remains a shoestring operation, and even though it's sometimes frustrating, we really wouldn't have it any other way. We know the price would be too high to bear. Our poverty enables us to be much closer to our fellowship. We all have to pull together, and in pulling together, we learn that we really are a part of something greater than ourselves. To me, that the idea of not keeping these big reserves of money on hand is something very beautiful. It's something that was written about in our past, and there's more to that chapter, and there's more that I could read, but as it goes on to talk about the price being too high and some of the insanities that would ensue even if we allowed members to contribute more than their fair share. It's really odd to see these words written in the past and then see the way they have actually manifest themselves in service structures that have opted to focus on money over the still suffering addict, or over their duty to take direction from the groups to serve the still suffering addict. I mentioned before, Excuse me. Um, I'm not going to get into what I mentioned before because I want to have their time to be for some questions and answers. So I'm going to try and be very brief about if you were to go to like a fellowship service conference, the way things operate there. So groups vote at the fellowship service conference. It's a group tally system. Um, Nobody has a vote other than the home groups. The idea being that groups have a group conscience. I go to my home group. To us, the home group that I participate in, and many people that I know, a group conscience has very little to do with taking votes. The group that I belong to hasn't taken votes in years, not because we can't. We haven't had a need to, because what happens is we view group conscience is kind of more a collective 11th step. And our newcomers don't even need to be on step 11 to participate in that. To just say we're praying, we're meditating, we're trying to find, you're trying to find your individual higher power's will for this group. And if you lack that at this time, you're trying to find what is best for this group in fulfilling its primary purpose to carry the message to the still suffering addict. Whether prayer just be asking people if you're not there yet, whether prayer be actually talking to your higher power, whatever you call God, and meditation, listening for that answer. But it's far more than, it's something that is a group, and a lot of groups that I know, and I know this isn't just specific to ASIS, and I don't mean to come across that way. I know there are a lot of groups that participate in other structures who view group conscience the same way. That it is just that we sit with it. We don't have emergency votes. We don't need to decide anything this week. We pray, we meditate, we take it home. We talk to sponsors, not necessarily with what do you think our group should do, but we consult sponsors the way we would in our regular recovery. Help me get in touch with this. Help me remove my ego. I've experienced things where a newcomer will come in and we're doing more debating and talking than actually removing ego. And we'll even be nearly at what would be called a consensus, for lack of a better term. And a newcomer who's just joined the group will say, you guys are full of shit. And then spit back to us the principles that we talk about in our service meetings and in our recovery meetings. And we'll take this home and sit with it. And the newcomer can come in and put us in check. But we have not had to vote for a very long time because we've come to a consensus. And I don't know how many times I have changed, not my vote, but my view, because what Chubs the Addict wants and what a loving higher power would express through our group conscience are two different things. When our home group was formed, I was the member with the most clean time, and I had several occasions where younger group members, for lack of a better term, would tell me, do you want to have a group conscience or you just want to be right? So that's the way we view group conscience. So when I was talking before, this is what I was going to reference before, about what little procedure there is. Number one, it's based on traditions and respect. So there doesn't have to be a whole lot of, what little procedure there is, it's always aimed at protecting group conscience. So groups join. Now, can you come as an area service representative and represent multiple groups? Yes, you can. You'll be casting multiple votes. Same thing goes for regions or whatever title you carry that groups have instructed you to do with their vote. And we have had that happen, but we don't actually have areas join the alternate service informational structure or join with other groups in directing that. We don't have regions do that because it's up to the groups. So let's say fictional region has 92 groups and 67 of them want to participate in ASIS. Well, that regional service representative would come to ASIS and represent those 67 groups or whatever number I said that had joined. So regions don't join. They don't force groups into participating in a service structure. We can have the regional service representation, but it's always the group vote that counts. I'm going to get a little bit into the way the voting works. So during the old business, there's no discussion on what's before us because that's already been decided by the groups. We talked about that in new business. It went back to the groups for input and review. The groups have group conscience. We don't. So any motion any year requires 80% to pass. And they're usually to do with either literature approval or procedural stuff at the conference because the groups take care of their service. A lot of this ends up being a lot more about fellowshipping. So it requires 80% to pass. Now, there is one caveat to that. The first year the motion is up, any group who votes no will hold that motion up for one more year for input and review. That gives them a chance to give their reason and the groups to consider it. And again, that might sound inconvenient or burdensome. It protects the group conscience and it keeps us away from emergency votes. A lot of times, and again, I'm sorry, my throat is getting dry, but a lot of times when there's been controversy within our fellowship, or more to the point, the services that are supposed to be serving our fellowship, it usually involves emergency votes and trying to push through an agenda too quickly. We don't act quickly on anything. At times people have been very frustrated with that, but it's all about making sure that the groups have their voice. So how does the 80% apply in the first year? Well, if groups abstain, they still count as part of the quorum, but if no group votes no, a motion can still pass its first year with 80%. One no vote will hold it up, but that group is asked to give the reason so that we can consider that. And there have been times where these reasons have been very valid before I even came in, and it's kind of where this practice first originated before it became a motion, when we had so many groups that we needed to have actually motions in place to solidify these things as more than just precedent, which is what they had when they were working with a smaller number of groups. But there was originally something they were trying to pass that some wording was off and only one group caught it. And when they took it back to the other groups, they went, oh my gosh, yeah, this could be misinterpreted. And they came back the next year and passed it 100%. And again, a lot of people think it's inconvenient. And I'm just going to put it bluntly, if you're somebody who believes that we need to be able to make motions on the conference floor and pass them this year, if you're someone who believes that we can change what the groups have told us at the group level, or that we could make motions without a group asking for it, then it might not be for you. But I would my personal view would be, it's not really about what I want, it's about what my home group wants and what my home group believes. So if your group believes that way, maybe it's not for your group, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be. Services are not part of Narcotics Anonymous in a way that we decide to create tools to help us as groups carry our message and to do things collectively that might, when we decide to act on that second half of the fourth tradition, because we need to coordinate with and consult with other groups. Maybe things like H&I, where there's 2 or 3 groups or many more serving the same facility. With regard to the voting, anything after the first, once a motion's been up for the first year, it only requires 80% to pass, regardless of no votes. There also is another voting category. It gives groups the option to abstain and count as part of the quorum, or to be present but not voting on this particular motion, in which case it gives the group the ability to say, we want to count as part of the quorum on this issue, or we don't. At the conference, you'll generally have, it's not set in stone, but generally you'll have people show up. The first night will be the group reports. The next day, I think it gets into voting on the old business. Then after the voting takes place, there's another session, usually after a break. I'm kind of going from memory here, so I might be a little bit off. But at that point, we do discuss the old business that was just voted on, so that people can take information back to their groups. Maybe a group wants to submit a motion the next year to undo what was just done, or a lot of times in old business, a motion hasn't passed. One thing that doesn't happen at the conference is motions don't fail. If a motion doesn't pass, it goes back to the fellowship for more input and review. That motion only goes away if the group who made the motion rescinds it, or the group who made the motion stops participating in the conference and no other group picks up the motion and runs with it. So there's not an idea of things need to be defeated. The idea is if a motion doesn't pass, it needs more input and review, and the groups who didn't make the motion don't get to change the motion. They give their input and review, and the home group that made the motion can then take that input and modify it or not modify it. And that has actually happened in years past. A lot of times when groups submit a motion, your group does so with the idea that if this motion passes, it's probably going to take 2 or 3 years. And we've actually seen groups rescind motions as well, where they say, hey, you know what? We got this wrong. Maybe we weren't in group conscience, or maybe this is right for our group, but the conscience of these other groups is that it's not right for them. Or maybe our group really does, through our group conscience, believe this should be the procedure at the conference, but the other groups don't see it that way. And sometimes groups have been known to rescind motions because they just realize that it's not what the other groups are going to approve anytime soon, and that's okay. Because it's always about the group, it makes it easier to not get ego involved. It's not my motion, it's the group's motion, and our group can do whatever we want outside the conference. I'm going to miss a whole bunch of stuff here. There's so much that if I cover it all, there's going to be no time for questions. And if there are no questions, then feel free to discuss whatever y'all want in the remaining time. My notes go on for quite a while. But I just want to say something personally. I've been going to this conference since 2015. I served as the chair for 3 years. And it doesn't give me any authority to speak for the conference. In fact, when I served as the chair, I was not allowed to have an opinion on the conference floor, which revealed a whole lot of my character defects to me. I couldn't even represent my group. Somebody else had to carry our group's conscience to that conference to keep the idea of the chair having any authority. And in terms of the NA service structure, or the service structure for NA that we participated in, I was viewed as the absolute lowest ranking member of that structure at the least important level of service, the world level, of the fellowship wide level. Within that service structure. In Narcotics Anonymous, we're all equal. It's another reason for me that services should not be part of NA. Sometimes we need clean time requirements for people to serve. That's not in line with our third tradition if services are part of NA. I need to rank lower than anybody in NA service if I'm the chair of the Fellowship Service Conference. We need to keep that inverted pyramid, for lack of a better term, inverted. That's not in line with our third tradition if services are part of NA. Services serve NA, they're tools for NA, they are only for NA. And again, I know that's not just my opinion, but that is my opinion, that is my understanding of the traditions. I just sat here and told you a lot about, and it's probably all clear as mud if you're new to it, especially no Robert's Rules of Order. A lot of groups who even don't recognize the concepts. A lot of times the service structures will still use Robert's rules. And there's not a problem with that as long as the Robert's rules don't outrank the traditions, which, you know, when I read back on some of the World Service Conference history, first Robert's rules were used to subvert group conscience and overrule the traditions, and eventually the concepts were used to delegate authority into that structure. Again, I don't spend too much time. I don't know hardly anything that happened at WSC this year because to me, NAS is a lost cause. For me personally, it's irrelevant. I participate in a home group that uses a service structure that doesn't deal with NAS at all. We've had a similar experience to what Terry was saying with some of the things that he's involved in. We don't get cease and desist letters. NAS has my legal name because we filed paperwork with them letting them know that we have never recognized the concepts or been a part of the conceptual service structure, and that we do not recognize. It was basically a declaration of autonomy, and it was a legal filing that we filed with legal entities in the state of California, and our group's not in California, but because that's where NAS is based in with them. So because of a legal piece of paperwork, they actually have my name. They've never so much as threatened to sue me. Our home group is hosted a website, originalna.org, that has been there since 2014. We've never received a threat. But back to what I was saying, I just gave everybody this idea of this structure of how ASIS operates in the Fellowship Service Conference and the Anonymity Foundation, and what those are. And again, the Fellowship Service Conference is just a conference that the groups who participate in ASIS use to direct that structure. But to me, that's not even the most important thing. If your group's going to consider being a part of ASIS, you need to know what it is and how it operates. But for me personally, it's about the traditionalist gathering. I used to apologize when I started crying. I'm not going to, because I'm going to try and stay so you can understand me. But when I came into Narcotics Anonymous, I had lost the ability to cry. My life was falling completely apart, and I couldn't shed a tear. When I came to Narcotics Anonymous, I learned how to cry, and to me, that's a beautiful thing that I can cry today. It's something that Steps has given me, and that the traditions gave me before I even set foot in an NA room, because the traditions made possible this fellowship by which I could work the NA program, the steps of Narcotics Anonymous, and not even work the program, learn how to live the program, because it's only work when I'm resistive. When I quit resisting, even the shit that seemed hard, like steps 4 and 9, become easy to happen. And there's been a lot of personal messages coming across the screen. I just want to say I love y'all too. But for me, the most important thing about the Fellowship Service Conference is the traditionalist gathering part of it. It's the only place that, and not that it doesn't happen in any meetings, but it's the only place that once a year I get to feel complete freedom, complete serenity, completely at ease. And it's not in the service meetings. It's at night when I walk out onto the deck overlooking the lake, and I get to talk with other addicts who are just there and who just love me. The Great Book talks a lot about we can have our lives fall apart completely in recovery, having not gone back to our old practices. The last 3 years, my life has fallen apart completely. I'm coming to you from my car because I live in my car. Last year, I hadn't been living in my car long, and I went to the conference, and there's a cat who goes to the conference. I don't know if he's in here today. I love him. He loves me. We've never had personal issues. But man, we have butted heads sometimes on the conference floor. We have butted heads in forums. We don't even agree on whether or not services should be part of NA. And I went out back. It's not always at night on deck. I was out back between sessions in the daytime, and this other addict was out there, and man, we connected on a level that I don't care about all the personal shit. And when character defects rear their heads, and people who participate in different aspects of the traditionalist movement butt heads, I don't apply that to this structure or that structure or them being representatives. They're addicts like me. We've all got character defects, and man, just we were able to share on a personal level some personal things about the way our thought processes work in an unhealthy manner, and what NA has given us to be able to surrender and have some character defects removed, and sometimes just put into remission. And again, this is a cat that we both are traditionalists, but we don't agree on a whole lot. And that's what it's about for me, is the fellowshipping that takes place. It's about the stuff that happens between addicts, both in the service meetings and outside. And I want to be real clear on something too, something that I left out really quickly here. There are groups who use literature that other groups don't. Most groups only use what we refer to as traditionalist literature, from my perspective. The older stuff like the Baby Blue, the second edition, the approval draft, the gray book, and then new stuff that we have written in open participation. There's groups that participate in that conference that also use sixth editions. And there's groups that participate in other service bodies that use concepts. Yeah, it's about the group. The group gets to decide when they participate in that conference. Um, we don't dictate to anybody there, and that's another beautiful thing. Another thing that I like, I don't know if it's still the case, I think it is, but some of these virtual platforms have been on the ASIS schedule for years. And there's different opinions even with people who participate in that. But again, the group gets to decide, the service body doesn't. I went way longer than I wanted to. I know there's only about 8, 9, 10 minutes for questions. So I apologize for speaking too long. I have a habit of doing that, but I'm gonna shut up now. Let people either ask questions of me or ask questions of each other with regard to previous stuff. So thank you to all of you for letting me be here and share my personal experience with the ASIS Structure and Fellowship Service Conference.